welcome back. Before we get started with example 2, determining the classification of all numbers, we're going to keep two things in mind. The first thing is that a square root of a negative number is not a real number. So we kind of talked about that. So let's say we have a square root of -4. So whenever there's a negative inside of a square root, it is not a real number. Remember, we kind of touched on it, right? All of these are real numbers: natural numbers, whole numbers, integers, rational numbers, and irrational numbers. But if you have a negative inside the square root, that is an imaginary number. And like I said, you're going to learn about that in Algebra 2. But for right now, we're going to call that not a real number. So anything like that, or square root of 123. Anytime there's a negative inside the square root, it is not a real number. It's called an imaginary number. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Also, the second thing to keep in mind is a fraction with a denominator of 0. So let's say we have 6/0, okay? This is the numerator, that's the denominator. So when there's a 0 in the denominator, the bottom part of the fraction, a fraction with the denominator of 0 is undefined because you cannot divide by 0. So it is not a number at all, okay? So it is undefined. All right, so keeping those two things in mind, let's go ahead and look at example 2, and we're going to classify all the numbers. So we're going to state if each number is rational, irrational, or not a real number. So what does it say? Rational. So anything in here, rational would be integer, whole number, or natural numbers, and then irrational, whoops, sorry about that, irrational numbers would be over here. Okay, so here we go. Let me fix this sheet. All right, so first off, I see a square root of a -4, right? So that's a negative inside of the square root, so that's going to be not a real number. So we're just going to say that's an imaginary number, right? Not a real number. And that's it. That's the answer. Perfect. Okay. 0 divided by 3. Now, there is a 0, but when the 0 is in the denominator, it's undefined. This is a 0 in the numerator, so 0 divided by 3 is just 0, okay? And 0 would be considered it would be a whole number, an integer, but out of these three, it would be a rational number because whole numbers and integers are rational numbers, so rational number. That is it. Okay. Let's look at this. So we have the square root of 4/9. So whenever you have a fraction, super easy, you just square root each portion, right? So we know that the 4 is a perfect squared. It's the same thing as 2 squared. So we're just going to simplify. And 9 is the same thing as 3 squared. And that square root and square just cancel each other out. Square root and squared cancel each other out. And so what we're left with is 2/3, which is a lovely, magnificent rational number. Perfect. I love these problems. Okay, then we get to the square root of 14. Now, square root of 14 is not a perfect squared number, right? So that means that it would be an irrational number. This number is going to go on and on and on forever with its decimals, and they're not going to terminate or repeat, which means it's going to be irrational. So anytime you have a square root that is not a perfect squared number, that's why it's so important to know what those perfect squared numbers are. So 14 is not, which means that this is going to be an irrational number. Okay, that is it. So I want you to go ahead and try E, F, G, and H on your own. So where's my friend? Here's my friend, the pause dragon. Remind you to pause your device. Go ahead and work out E, F, G, and H. And then when you get done, press play and we'll talk about it. All right, see you in a bit. Okay, let's see how you did. So first one, E, we have that 0 in the denominator. So that means it's going to be undefined. Okay, that would be the answer. So it is not a real number. So it's undefined, so it's not a real number. So remember, we had to state if it was one of these three, rational, irrational, or not a real number. So if it's undefined, that means it's not a real number. Okay, so if you got that right, woohoo, good job. Okay, let's go here. We got the square root of 1/16. So when we have a square root of fraction, no problem. We're just going to square root each portion of the numerator and the denominator. We know that 1 is a perfect square. It's the same thing as 1 squared. And we know that 16 is also a perfect square because it's the same thing as 4 squared. And then the square root and the squared cancel each other out. It's like Fruit Ninja. And then these cancel each other out as well. And we're left with 1/4, which is a lovely, magnificent, rational number. So if you got that one right, great job. Okay, let's go on to G. So we have a square root of a -15. So that negative inside the square root means it's an imaginary number. So out of the 3, it's going to be not a real number. So if you got that right, great job. And then lastly, right here, square root of 26. 26 is not a perfect squared number. So that means that this is going to be a number that's going to go on and on forever, which means it's going to be an irrational number. Okay, if you got all those right, yokodenkimashita, you did a wonderful job. If not, go ahead and fix your work so it looks exactly like mine. All right, I'll see you in a little bit for example 3.